Live from Mitchell Hall at the University of Delaware, this is Delaware Debates.
Good evening, I'm Nancy Karibjanian. On behalf of Delaware First Media, WDDE 91.1 FM, and the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication, welcome to Delaware Debates 2012, made possible with the financial support of AARP Delaware and the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. Joining me to co-moderate our debate this evening is Jason Mycoff, University of Delaware Professor of Political Science and International Relations. Our first debate includes the candidates in the race for the U.S. House of Representatives, Democrat John Carney, the incumbent, and Republican Tom Kovach. Gentlemen, welcome, and welcome to you as well, Jason. Now, our debate tonight is going to be divided into two parts. Following a 1-minute opening statement from each of our candidates, Jason Mycoff and I will pose questions to the candidates. Their responses in this section are limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds with a 1-minute rebuttal, and then we will have opportunity for a follow-up discussion. We will then turn to the students from the University of Delaware and Delaware State University for questions. Responses in this portion are limited to 1 minute. Each candidate will also have a 1-minute closing statement. Now, our live audience here in Mitchell Hall on the University of Delaware's Newark campus understands that this is about the candidates and there will be no applause during tonight's debate. We held a coin toss prior to coming in here to determine the order for this evening, and with that, we've learned that we will begin with John Carney, who has the first opening statement. Mr. Carney.
Thank you, Nancy, and good evening to you. Thank the University of Delaware and Delaware First Media for sponsoring this debate tonight, and thank all of you for coming. When I ran for Congress in 2010, I told people I'd do in Washington what I did here in Delaware, work across the aisle to get things done. I learned a long time ago, growing up in Claymont with my 8 brothers and sisters, that compromise and working together was part of life. And that's the attitude that I've taken to Washington. Early on, I started a bipartisan breakfast group. We focus on areas where we agree instead of where we disagree. There are plenty of people in Washington focusing on areas where they disagree. Building on those relationships, we've had some success. We passed 3 bills to create jobs, reduce drug shortages, and help veterans get jobs when they come home. Our country faces some big challenges, to be sure, but if I'm reelected, I'll continue to work across the aisle to solve these problems and get things done. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to your questions.
And Tom Kovach, your opening statement.
Thank you. It's really my pleasure to be here. It's an honor for me to be sitting at this table with Congressman Carney, looking to debate the issues. I thank the University of Delaware, Delaware First Media. I got into public service in December of 2008. I left my private practice behind with my family's support to make a difference for our state. And I did that. I did that as a Republican in a very Democratic district. And then I went on to serve as Newcastle County Council President, again, outnumbered, but really with the support of the community. I've served as an independent voice for the state of Delaware, first as a state representative, and now as the council president, and I'm honored to do so. It's my greatest joy when not Republicans come up to me and tell me what a good job I'm doing, but independents and Democrats, and yes, even progressive Democrats have come up to me and said, thank you for representing us across this county. I intend on doing that at the state level. I have a record of standing up for the citizens all across Delaware. Okay. And I bring that private sector experience to represent you in D.C.
Please
Thank
understand it's my job to keep us all on time, so that is what I'll be doing. And let's begin with our questions then, all right? And again, I will be helping to keep you on time. Mr. Carney, Delaware's unemployment rate remains lower than the national average, but it really hasn't changed much over the past few months. The election will confirm, though, whether Americans have become somewhat impatient, waiting for that jump start to the economy. Your focus has been on the Make It in America agenda, a return to U.S. manufacturing, an initiative that, if it's successful, is going to take some time to play out, especially to see measurable results here. So are you asking Delaware voters to be patient and wait for an economic turnaround?
Well, certainly job creation, getting the economy going again is the #1 priority. It's the first thing I think of every day when I get up. I work hard with Governor Markell, with our congressional delegation, to do what we can to set the stage and make it possible for businesses to create jobs. A couple months ago, the chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, and the Secretary of Treasury came into our committee, Financial Services Committee, and when asked by members of the committee what the Congress could do to strengthen the economy, to create jobs, they both said the same thing. We need to do no harm in the short term, and we need a strong fiscal plan that gets our deficits under control in the long term. You've heard about the fiscal cliff. That is automatic spending cuts that kick in at the end of the year, as well as the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. Congress needs to act to put in place a plan to reset those tax rates. Small businesses tell me they need certainty. Big, medium, and small businesses, they need certainty with respect to tax policy. They need certainty with respect to regulations. That's what the Congress can do to put people back to work. I've always supported an infrastructure program. We've not been able to get it passed in the House of Representatives. There are members on the other side of the aisle who think that that's wasteful spending. That puts people back to work right away on ports and bridges and roads. Lots of infrastructure will strengthen our economy. It's the foundation of a strong economy, put people back to work in the short term, and help our economy in the long term.
Mr. Kovach, your 1-minute rebuttal.
Thank you. I don't think we can afford to be patient. I think we have really sat back as a country and stood there while our economy has not recovered. We've tried stimulus packages, but what we really haven't tried is to address the core fundamental problem of why our businesses aren't working. I spent the last 15 years counseling small, medium, and even large-sized businesses. What they're finding is, exactly as Congressman Carney mentioned, they're not predictable. You can't plan for the future. And part of this planning is the reaction by our leadership, by our Congress. We're facing a fiscal cliff. We're facing tax cuts that are going to automatically happen. Our businesses have already started to slow down, to not hire, and to limit their employees and to reduce that employment from 40 hours to 30 hours so they're not full-time employees with the burden of full-time health care that are going to be mandated on our employers. We have to back up what we're doing, make sure we get out of the way as the government, and make sure our businesses can operate and perform their businesses as they should.
Where do you fall on the issue of streamlining businesses, gentlemen, as we begin our follow-up conversation here? There's been a lot of discussion about streamlining regulations. When you take a look at Delaware as an example, the state's already accused of being too business-friendly and having policies which actually led to the credit crisis, according to many analysts. So where do you feel we need to go as far as regulating business? I'm going to toss this to you first.
So again, let's remember that 65% of the new jobs are created by small businesses. So there needs to be a demand for the goods and services that they provide, and of course that has not been there with people losing their jobs and without the income. But what we can do in the government and in Congress is set the conditions where they can be successful. Certainty on the tax front and on the regulatory front. I introduced a bill in the Congress that would reform regulations, that would require the administration to come to the Congress with a list of regulations that are out of date, duplicative, or ineffective, so we could take one vote and take them off the books right away.
I need to ask you to just join into the conversation here along with my co-moderator so that we can actually discuss this and your views on what your opponent has said.
I think we really do need to address this right away. We have many regulations that aren't serving to protect public safety or the environment or do the function that they're designed to protect. What we need to do is take a look at those. I've experienced doing that, again, working in the private sector, working with government, specifically, for example, in the brownfields redevelopment area. It's a project process that used to take between 19 and 22 months. We value stream mapped that process, eliminated all the unnecessary and superfluous legislation and regulation that put us around in circles, and now that program is successful and it operates between 9 and 11 months, and for every $1 the state puts in, it gets $17 back to our economy. That's something the private sector and the public sector can work to do together.
Well, one of the meaningful things that I've done in my first 2 years in Congress is to work together with Stephen Fincher, a Republican from Tennessee, on a bill to make it easier for emerging growth companies to do an initial public offering. The fact of the matter is that about 50 to 70% of the jobs in a company like that are created after they go public. And in addition, the state of Delaware gets corporate franchise tax revenue from those companies when they expand, issue more stock, and go public. Now, that's not a short-term solution, but all the people in the venture world have told me that it's a real positive thing for new emerging growth companies. That's where job creation is going to come from in the future.
Let me let you have one last word on this.
One last word, and that's great when we get to that point, but what we need is our businesses to start up. We need to take an aggressive approach. Let investors and entrepreneurs use their 401k programs for up to 18 months, penalty-free, interest-free, and invest in their own businesses so we can have those entrepreneurs and those small businesses start up using their own capital without the government interference.
All right, we're going to move on to our next topic, and Jason Mycoff has that question.
The next question is about national debt. The United States national debt is over $16 trillion and growing due to a gaping annual budget deficit. Mr. Kovach, you've said that making a promise to not raise taxes under any circumstance is irresponsible and refused to sign a pledge against raising taxes. Does this mean that you would consider raising taxes to reduce the budget deficit and the national debt?
I believe that everything should be on the table, and to most responsibly represent our state and our country. I believe that means everything. That means revenues in the form of taxes. I think if somebody came to me and said, we could lower our spending by 8%, but to get this plan in gear, we would actually have to raise revenues, raise taxes 2%. If we did so by making the tax code flatter, more predictable, and much more business-friendly, I think that would accomplish all of those goals at once. And yes, I would vote for such a plan to make sure that we were back on the right track. This $16 trillion debt has to be reined in, and it has to be reined in immediately with instant action. We can't just cut spending. There isn't enough spending to cut to get us back on the right track. But we have to increase revenues in a way that don't further harm our fragile small business economy.
Mr. Carney, you have a 1-minute rebuttal.
Well, I said a moment ago that the chairman of the Fed and the Secretary of Treasury came to our committee and said that the most important thing that Congress can do is to do no harm in the short term and to pass a deficit reduction plan in the long term that approaches $4 trillion in deficit reduction. There's a plan out there. The president established a budget deficit commission. They put together a plan. It's referred to as the Simpson-Bowles plan. It's balanced, it's fair, it's comprehensive. It includes additional revenues. It includes substantial spending cuts. It also addresses entitlement programs. That's the kind of approach that we have to take. We had a vote on that budget in the House of Representatives. Only 38 members, 20 Democrats and 18 Republicans voted for that plan. I was one of the 38. That's the kind of thing. That's what it's going to be. If you ask Senator Carper and Senator Coons in the Senate, there are close to 50 votes for a plan like that. We have to put that in place. It'll get our deficits under control in the long term, and it'll help stimulate confidence in the
we
short
can now
term.
have follow-up on this issue.
Let's assume, and there's a question for both of you, let's assume that waste, fraud, and abuse will not solve the national debt problem, right?
They won't.
All right, so they won't.
And it won't.
And now, what, if any, meaningful cuts are you prepared to make to the budget to rein in the deficit and lower the debt?
Well, there are lots of areas where we can cut, and it's got to be everywhere. But the reality is we can identify cuts, and I will. We should close down military bases overseas, consolidate those bases. We should cut. We shouldn't be spending money for infrastructure and nation building in Afghanistan. We should be doing nation building here in the U.S. We can eliminate subsidies to oil and gas companies that are out of date, costing government billions of dollars. I can go down item by item, but we need a comprehensive plan where everything's on the table. We got revenue and spending cuts as part of a big plan.
It's part of the discussion, so.
Look, we can cut, and we do need to cut. We need to identify programs. We also need cost containment for our expensive parts of our economy, like healthcare. I think that the ACA, while it does a few good things, it does not deal with the cost containment, which is a large government expense in paying for the medical expenses, which is 1/6 of our economy. I think we need to adopt a better energy policy, which lets us spend less overseas, less troops around the world, less money given to conflicting nations because our energy is so dependent.
I disagree, because the only chance that we have, other than creating a voucher system, as my friend Paul Ryan on the Republican side has suggested for Medicare, to get our deficits under control in the long term, is to reduce healthcare costs, particularly in Medicare. Consider this: over the next 40 years, the number of people 65 and older is going to double in this country, and the people under 65 who pay through payroll tax to Medicare is only going to be up 30%. Those numbers don't work.
And I think that's right. We absolutely need to cut our medical costs and the cost of access to medical care. And the ACA does little to nothing to actually cut those costs. What they do is they distribute those costs. And instead of having one person pay nothing, you're distributing those costs among a large group of people, but you're doing nothing to hold down the costs. We need tort reform to lower
perfect example of that is the $700 billion in Medicare savings that has been part of the presidential debate. That's actually the kind of savings, paying providers less, getting efficiency, reducing waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicare. That's the kind of savings. What that does, it makes Medicare more sustainable and more viable for more years. And by the way, it's part of the Ryan budget.
Paying doctors less doesn't solve our medical problems. What it does is we have to reduce the cost of our medical providers providing that cost by getting away some of the harmful tort reform, getting rid of some of the harmful tort laws that we have in place, minimize these elements of defensive medicine that are practiced that drive up the cost of medical care. If we're prescribing procedures that aren't needed, we are driving up the cost of medical care, and we need to address that.
We're going to move on. I have to close out that topic. Maybe we'll be able to revisit it in a few moments. But let's move on to the issue of education, because President Bush declared No Child Left Behind the most dramatic education reform effort in a generation, and it set lofty goals, as we all know. The Obama administration calls education, its agenda, as a quiet revolution. Mr. Carney, from STEM schools to Race to the Top, Vision 2015, charter, choice, all the way back, as I remember, and I think you do as well, New Directions in Delaware. As a parent, it seems to me that there isn't a fix that this state has not tried. You have had a front row seat to many of these initiatives. So do you think that the federal government should now be involved in education reform?
Well, let me tell you this. I've been involved in this in a long time ago. In fact, I was raised by two educators, two teachers, and they're sitting in the hall tonight. I hope they grade me well at the end of this. But we have been through a lot. I came through as a student here at the University of Delaware, and it was the crisis in education. The reality of it is, education is about a good, strong teacher in front of a classroom that's disciplined, where she has the abilities to address and get across to every single student. All this other entrapments around this is just extra. Now, the federal role, it's a more limited role, is to provide additional resources, mostly for disadvantaged kids. I keep talking about this fiscal plan that we need. One of the things that we have to fight for in terms of investments is investments in education, both at the elementary, secondary, and higher education level. That's going to be a difficult thing to maintain.
Mr. Kovach, you have a 1-minute rebuttal on the issue of education.
I think what you ask is about the federal involvement on the education level. We've seen that many times. You've mentioned some of the programs, first President Bush, then President Obama, and they've been largely unsuccessful. That's because the top-down approach from the federal government is largely unsuccessful. What you need to do is transfer control from this federal government to the local control. What programs haven't we tried in Delaware that hasn't worked? How about local rule, local control? We've had successful charter schools that have had that local control. Why don't we take that program and give the authority to our principals to allocate their resources within this state so that they can, in their individual school, make the decisions that are best serving those students. That's actually one of the models we haven't tried, is bring the federal government back in, rein in that control and that spending, and give that control to our schools and our principals so that they can make the decisions facing the kids that they are educating.
Well, now we're into the follow-up.
The state of Delaware has actually been a leader in educational reform in our state. You mentioned charter schools, school choice. You mentioned accountability regimes. I think all these things are important. But at the end of the day, it's about getting good teachers, giving the resources and tools they need to educate children in individual classes, using data so that they know the specific needs of individual kids and that they can reach every individual child. That's the beauty, if you will,
but if
of
the
No
federal
Child Left
government is
Behind.
involved, as with No Child Left Behind, there's already 33 states that have received waivers from this. So it seems that as the federal government makes a step forward, there is this call for local rule that then waters down, and then generations end up graduating from schools not having full reform.
My own view is that some of those requirements, the No Child Left Behind, or expectations, were unrealistic in terms of where you could be when, and that's what the waivers were all about. But the reality of it is, if we're going to be the global economic power that we've been for years, we need to educate our children as well as any country in the world. And right now, we're not at the top.
And what we need to do is stop listening to the special interest groups that are seeming to control and have an overly decisive say in our education strategy. Listen to the group of teachers. We don't need to listen to the teachers' unions to tell us how to teach. We need to listen to our teachers. My wife's a teacher. I know John's wife is involved in education. We need to listen to the teachers. We need to listen to the parents on how to actively reform our education system. And a lot of that is, again, providing the flexibility that you need on that local level and those resources.
However, if you go to total flexibility and local rule, does that not take us back to where we were in Delaware, let's say 30 years ago, maybe 25, where you had a good school district and then a not so achieving school district and then a less achieving district, where people were actually buying homes based upon scores in schools?
And that's an important point, because really a lot of this recent reform has been about high standards. And we need to set high standards, and particularly in math
So let
and
me
science,
get
where
Mr.
we
Kovach
can
to clarify how he feels
So
about.
absolutely. So what we're doing with No Child Left Behind is we're pushing from the bottom. We're not incentivizing those good schools, those charter schools with the IB programs like we have it locally at Mount Pleasant. It's at a good school, it's in a good school districts. That doesn't mean that we don't have minimum standards. What it means is you leave it to the freedom of the local districts to figure out how you're going to get there. Every community is different and having different needs. And if we force this federal model of education, this Illinois model of education on Delaware, in Edgemoor, in Claymont.
So let me just ask you then, where do you feel about the race to the top then, Delaware getting that grant? If we shouldn't have a lot of federal involvement, then should that not happen?
I want to know, of that $113 million, how much has ended up in the classroom? And I'll say zero has ended up in our
I think
classrooms.
the race to the top funding is an important part of the federal role. A lot of that money went to schools that were struggling. Many of those schools had disadvantaged kids. That traditionally has been the role of the federal government in education, and it should continue to be so.
All right, so we will now park our issue of education and we'll turn over to Jason for healthcare and other issues.
That's right. The next question is on healthcare. And the House of Representatives has voted 33 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Kovach, you've stated that you would seek to repeal the harmful components of the Affordable Care Act, but would want to allow parents to cover their children until age 26. You'd like to keep pre-existing coverage portability. How would you pay for these parts of the plan without the mandatory health coverage that increases the revenue base?
It increases the revenue base. I think that's maybe even a faulty assumption to begin with. If we're having the federal government pay for insurance, for example, this revenue stream is going to predicted to cost, the ACA is predicted to cost about $2.4 trillion. If the federal government wanted to insure 24 million uninsured people for 6 years, which is the plan under the ACA, at a cost, say about $5,000 per person, it ends up costing $900 billion. This plan, on the other hand, costs $2.4 trillion. I want to know where the other $1.5 trillion of taxpayer money is going to provide this insurance for people. I don't believe we need insurance for everyone in order to provide accessibility to health care. What we need to do, again, is help reform the system. You want to make sure that an insurance company can't drop an individual just because they were able to have their cancer go into remission. If they would change jobs, they would no longer be insured. That's unacceptable. And quite frankly, that doesn't serve to be a huge cost driver. And children until they're 26, we're actually treating the symptom. We should be asking, why are our children coming home after incurring $80,000 to $100,000 worth of school loans and having to come home and get on their parents' insurance? But by doing that, we do allow that flexibility for those who haven't yet found unemployment, and that's not costly either. And that cost is actually passed on to the insurance payer, not the government.
Mr. Carney, you have a 1-minute rebuttal on the issue.
Well, I didn't know we were up to 33 times that we voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I thought it was only 31, but we seem to do it every week. Look, the Affordable Care Act, in my opinion, is the only chance that we have to get our health care costs under control. I have a significant difference with my opponent on this question. There are a lot of things like payment reform that are part of the Affordable Care Act, patient-centered medical homes, something that we're starting in here in Delaware, prevention, a focus on prevention. We spend, listen to this, we spend twice as much as the average of any country around the world, and we don't get near the results. They can't be that smart, and we can't be that dumb. So we got to figure out what works. We've got to implement those things and bring down the cost. Affordable Care Act's the only thing, the only chance that we have. People like the fact that pre-existing condition is gone. They like that kids can stay on their parents' insurance until they're 26. I like the fact that there's no lifetime caps, but guess what?
Let's open it to
You got to have a
discussion.
system that makes it work.
So as a follow-up, you voted in favor of the Affordable Care Act. You also voted to repeal a portion of
That's
the
right.
act, right, involving small business reporting. What else needs to be done to make the act as effective a solution as possible in providing health care while protecting the economy?
Well, the biggest thing that needs to be done, as I mentioned, these programs that are based, whose purpose is to contain costs. We have to focus on implementing those and make sure that they work. But many of them are new. Payment reform, paying doctors and hospitals for results, not for the number of procedures that are done. That's the concept behind patient-centered medical home. Give the doctor the charge of a case. Say, hey, John Carney, you come in, he's going to pay attention to the various needs I have, do my test, make sure I have all my vaccinations and all that, and then refer me to get things done. But make sure through electronic medical records that we don't have a lot of duplication going on. It's very complicated, but it's our only chance of bringing healthcare costs
I just
down.
want to remind you, we are in the discussion portion.
Again, we do have a difference in opinion here, and my thought is, and it's a humorous saying, but it's very accurate. If you think healthcare is expensive now, wait till it's free. And when it's free, people don't have that personal responsibility to exercise discretion on whether to seek care, whether to seek an MRI on an elbow that's bruised. And unless we reform our tort system, we're not going to get rid of the practice of defensive medicine that drives up, and it's the incredible cost driver in prescribing routine exams that aren't needed, going in for an MRI when you do bang your elbow. These are costly items. We are running out of money that we can afford to pay for cancer treatments, blood therapies. And what we are doing instead is we're going to let everybody have free insurance to get things covered that they don't need, and wasting money that we need for research.
Would you define it as free insurance?
I wouldn't define it as free insurance, but I would say this, that one of the things that I'm concerned about, and the act is not perfect. We amended and took out the 1099 requirement, which was really an ill-conceived idea from the start. But I'm concerned about some of the mandated coverages that are in the act because that costs money. And you're requiring people to have insurance that in some cases they may not be able to afford, and that's something that we're going to have to look at.
One of the things we haven't even addressed is, and by the way, I'm not the author of the Ryan plan, so I don't have to defend that here tonight.
Well, every Republican in the House voted for it.
Well, that's great. Almost every Republican has also signed on to the anti-tax pledge, which I haven't. I am not that type of Republican. I think my record establishes that. And what I would do if I was in Congress is make sure that we can have a system that works for the people, that makes sure that we have the system that doesn't take money out of Medicare. I think we can both agree that Medicare is in trouble. But what we have,
this is a big issue because there's a lot of misinformation going on about that is savings, the kind of savings that we need to get in our healthcare system, the $700 billion. You know, what the Republicans are out there saying this is a cut, the Democrats have cut Medicare. That's not what it is at all. There are savings that have been realized through the Affordable Care Act as part of that program, and that's the kind of we need to get more savings like that in the rest of our healthcare system.
We will see if we can revisit healthcare in a little bit. Let's move on to other issues. Mr. Carney, politics is clearly the necessary element for a U.S. representative from Delaware. You're the only representative in the House for the state, and you have to be able to work on both sides to be able to keep Delaware's interests in the forefront. Now, your opponent has referred to your style in Congress, and I'm going to quote him by saying, "It's not my job to sit in the back and sit on my hands and maybe do things to get reelected." He has also said that you want to be liked rather than lead. Now, it's his place to explain what he means by that. But I have to note that it is that laid-back approach of yours that many attribute to your loss 4 years ago in the primary for governor, a position that people just assumed was yours for the taking. So are you too reserved to really make a difference?
Well, people made a bad assumption if they assumed that was mine for the taking. But let me just say, no. In fact, I think my style is appropriate for what we need in Washington. We need in Washington right now Democrats and Republicans that are willing to sit down, listen to one another, focus on areas where we agree, and get things done. That's exactly what I've tried to do. I'm a workhorse. I'm not a show horse. I go down there every day. I meet with my friends on the other side of the aisle. We come up with ideas. We've had lots of good ideas. We've had bills that passed, working on it together. the IPO bill, which I mentioned a while ago. Steve Fincher was the main Republican sponsor, the main sponsor of the bill, and I was the lead Democratic sponsor. And I have that, by the way, if you would like to take a look at the front of the bill. And we worked together. I lined up about 10 or more Republican and Democratic co-sponsors. We worked the hearing together. We worked at different issues that came up from my side of the aisle. I fought back certain amendments that we thought weren't appropriate. He fought back amendments on his side. The only way to solve these problems, healthcare, the deficit, the budget, all these things, you got to work together. Otherwise, you're going to get one-sided solutions that don't satisfy everybody.
You have a 1-minute rebuttal.
Thank you. I think we've heard my opponent say during previous element of the debate, it's Congress's job to do no harm. It's Congress's job to do no harm. Actually, it's Congress's job to directly fix the problem. And these are difficult problems, and they are complex problems. And I appreciate the Congressman working across the aisle to address initial public offerings of a company. And what we need to do is work across the aisle to address the incredible burden that the regulatory scheme has put on our small businesses and startups and not allowed our small businesses and startups to exist. I've talked to numerous businesses in Delaware who don't have the opportunity to expand, don't have that opportunity to access the capital. We need to free up capital in this marketplace. We need to definitely work across both sides of the aisle to get that done. But focusing in on the little things, focusing in on things that aren't going to kickstart our economy are not helpful. We need to do more than reach across the aisle. We need to stand up, take a place in the center of the aisle, and say, who's with me?
But you've already echoed statements made by Mr. Carney earlier. You have also said, I'm not that kind of Republican. Should you be elected, how are you then going to fit in if the Republicans control the House?
That's a great question. I don't care about fitting in. I care about representing Delaware. I think I've shown in my 2 years in the State House, first, my ability to stand up to the awful, evil other side, but also to stand up to my own side. I'm so sick of this partisan rhetoric. I am a Republican because I believe in a smaller, more effective government. But I'm not a Republican who's going to sit and listen to my caucus and not vote the way I think I should vote, based on my caucus, based on the pressure and from PACs, from fundraisers, from people who have had these influence on our elections.
Let me get Mr. Carney in here because we are in the discussion portion. How do you respond to that?
I think that the approach that I take every day in Washington, with the Delaware's interests and the interests of job creation and strengthening our economy every day, is the right way to go. When I talk to people across our state, Democrat, Republican, and Independent, they tell me that's what they want me to do. When I ran in 2010, they told me that they wanted me to do in Washington the way I've done in Delaware, working across the aisle to get things done. We have a tradition in Delaware. It's called Return Day. And as you know, at the end of that ceremony, we bury the hatchet. The chairman of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they put the hatchet in the box and they put sand from Dewey Beach over top of it. When I was sworn in Washington, I think the speaker gave me a hatchet. And people use it all the time. What I've tried to focus on, and with some discomfort from my Democratic colleagues, is to work with my friends from across the aisle to get things done on things that we can agree on.
So with that said, you've said you were given possibly a hatchet, if not a figurative one. You've called your time in D.C. difficult, challenging, and frustrating. So why go back?
It's been all of the above.
So why go back?
Because we need people like me in that chamber to do the business of the country. Look, I got a call about 2 months ago from a Marine from the Department of Defense. And a Marine from Magnolia had been injured in Afghanistan. And I called him up. He didn't say much to me. All he could think about, though, was that he wanted to get back to his base. We need members of Congress who put the country ahead of themselves, like that Marine from Magnolia. And that's what inspires me, and that's what I try to do every day.
Mr. Kovach, do you think you're ready? You have won special elections. You've had time in the House, limited time in the House, limited time in County Council. Are you ready for this? Are you ready to be given a hatchet after you're swearing in?
I think being in the practice of law, representing companies for, again, mom and pop businesses to medium-sized businesses, to being involved in multi-billion-dollar patent litigation, I am definitely ready. And not only am I ready, I have a perspective from the outside world that my opponent just doesn't have. I have been involved with business. I know, I've counseled, I've sat at the table with these businesses. trying to work to make sure that they can get by, that they can get through this governmental regulation that's getting in their way, not protecting the public, and getting in the way of their success and their expansion and hiring employees, which is what we need to be focused on.
We're going to move on now. Jason's going to take us to issues of foreign policy.
Starting in December 2010, a wave of democratic protests across the Middle East led to economic, social, and political reforms across the region, and even regime change in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Mr. Kovach, in your view, what role should the United States take in fostering democracy in the Middle East? Should we be an active partner in aiding democratic movements, and to what extent?
I think the best answer for that is to examine the history of both the regions in which these events occur and our history of unsuccessful involvement in what's been called democratic experiments. Unfortunately, we have a history in this country in getting in and supporting regime changes, and then the next regime ends up being a lot more troubling to us as a country, a lot more troubling in terms of human rights violations than the previous. We wade in with good intentions and end up with ill effects. What we need to do is stand up with our allies in the region, especially Israel, one of the last bastions of democracy in the area. And what we need to do is reduce our dependency on these non-democratic states so we don't have to feel the need to weigh in to these conflicts based on our quest and our need for oil. We need to have a foreign policy that's informed by good judgment, not by the need for petrochemical supplies. We need to back off and have our own energy independence, develop a different energy policy so that we are not dependent on oil and resources from foreign countries and therefore waste human lives and our limited capital overseas where it's not necessary.
You have a 1-minute rebuttal.
Well, I think that we have to have a smart foreign policy. Early on in my last 2 years, I took a trip to Afghanistan. And the main impression I got when I was there in Afghanistan, that this notion of nation building, the idea that somehow we could shape a country that is as backward as Afghanistan is, that we could rebuild their military and rebuild their security forces and reform a government and build schools and roads and highways, was just very unrealistic. We're talking about building a military and security forces that would cost $5 billion a year in a country that has a total GDP of $1.6 billion. So it's totally unrealistic. That's not, we have considerable national interests at stake in Libya, in Iran, in Syria. And we have to take an individual approach to each of those situations and be careful about whether or not we're going to get boots on the ground. That should be the last option based on our national security interests.
When would, as a follow-up, when would it be correct to send boots to be on the ground? When should we send the armed forces in a situation where you've said this is in our national interest? What kind
Clearly,
of
when our
national
national interests are at stake, and that's defined differently, I think, for every single country, the situations are different. What we might have done in Libya is certainly different than what we're doing now currently in Syria, and I believe it should be. What we did in Afghanistan going in to get al-Qaeda, I think that was the appropriate thing, but to do it as an anti-terrorist mission and not a nation-building kind of mission. So every single country is different. Chief among them, we need to think about our strongest ally and the country that we have a special relationship with, and that is Israel. It is a very dangerous part of the world. I traveled there when I was running for Congress in 2010. I saw the very fragile nature of their borders with Syria there and Lebanon and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and the Gaza. We need to make sure that we are hand in glove with Israel, particularly with respect to the Iranian
Mr. Kovach,
threat.
when do you think we should put boots on the ground?
Well, I'd still be interested in hearing the Congressman's response to that, but what I think is we need to examine the situation in each individual country. And if it is calculated to be in our best interest. For example, in Afghanistan, it's not as simple as, well, we're just nation building. We're just, well, what we're doing is preventing terror cells from going into this vacuum we create upon an immediate or planned call out on a particular date in a particular month. What we have to do is examine our security, examine the cost, the lives at stake, and the economic cost of going into these nations. It would be great if we had unlimited resources and go around and democratize the rest of the world. It won't work, it's not worth our money, and it's certainly not worth our troops' lives overseas. I
would just reiterate that every situation has to be different. We need to approach the the conflicts in each country with our national interest at stake, and we need to be realistic and smart about our policy as it goes forward, particularly when it relates to putting boots on the ground.
Earlier in your response, you talked about supporting our allies. Does this mean that we should be supporting dictators over democracy?
Actually, when I said support our allies, I think I referred to our democratic allies and Israel. And I said what we need to do is not be so supportive. We sent our Secretary of State over to meet with the League of Arab Nations, none of which are democratic nations. But yet we are supporting them with intelligence. We're supporting them with an incredible amount of money. And as a matter of fact, we're supporting enemies of our allies with an incredible amount of money because we're dependent upon their oil reserves and their oil resources. I think we need to really identify who our allies are. They're not the ones that provide us with oil. Our allies are the ones.
About 10 seconds if you want to make a final point.
I would just say that a good, strong energy policy here in the United States where we could be more energy independent would have a very positive effect on these relationships.
Believe it or not, that concludes the first part of our debate. We're going to turn now to student questions. A reminder to each of you that you will have 1 minute to answer each student question. And the first student question goes to Mr. Carney, and it comes from Josh Vadekis, a junior biology major from the University of Delaware.
During this presidential race, there's been a lot of talk on increasing the income tax on upper-class voters in order to make up some of the deficit. However, this ignores the fact that most of the super rich actually make most of their money from capital gains. My question to the candidates is, would you or would you not support increasing the capital gains tax on super rich voters?
Mr. Carney, your answer first.
Well, first of all, tax reform and revenue has to be part of a deficit reduction plan, and that's where it fits in. We've talked about that already. I've already voted to allow the tax cuts on people over $250,000 to expire, and I think that is part of the Simpson-Bowles plan. With respect to capital gains, there is an advantage to have a lower rate for capital gains, but what I would do right now, a long-term capital gain where you get the lower rate is only 1 year. I would extend that out. I think that's too short, and I would consider eliminating or raising that rate for capital gains as part of a fair and balanced deficit reduction plan.
Mr. Kovach, 1 minute.
Again, we have limited resources. We need more revenues, and I think everything has to be on the table. And then you need to look at the effect on the economy of taxing, quote, the super rich. I wish there was enough of the super rich to solve all our economic problems. There isn't. The question was on capital gains. This is on money that's invested, money that has already been taxed. It's already gone through the taxation system, come out after being taxed and being reinvested. There's a good reason why it has a lower rate. It's because you're trying to encourage those investors to place their investment in our companies. And I do agree with Congressman Carney that we need to analyze really how those capital gains are fairly allocated. Can we encourage those investments by enlarging the rate, or more importantly, redefining what's a short-term versus a long-term? I think we do. Short-term capital gains are not the same as long-term.
We're now going to turn to the issue. We're going back to the issue of partisanship, and this question is coming from a freshman political science major from the University of Delaware.
There's been a lot of concern about growing partisanship in politics. Name one member of the other party that you would work well with.
Mr. Kovach, you're up first. 1 minute.
I would enjoy very much working with our Senator Chris Coons. I think that for me, to be an effective representative of Delaware has to work well with the opposite party member in Congress. I think that's actually what's made us a great state, is we always have had bipartisan representation of our state. When you have all your eggs in one basket, it doesn't work very well. We need to partner up, as Congressman Castle, one of my mentors, has done consistently over the years with the Democratic members of the Senate. And I would like to very much, because I know he's going to be there when I get there next year, because he's the only one not up for re-election, I would be happy to work with our Senator Chris Coons to build those bridges and make sure that we can jointly, as a Republican and a Democrat, provide the representation that Delaware needs.
Mr. Carney, 1 minute.
I'm going to cheat and name two. First, Pat Meehan, Representative Pat Meehan from right over the line in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. He and I have worked together from before we actually were sworn in. We visited the Boeing facility there in Ridley Park. That facility employs 750 Delawareans. we've worked to save the refineries in Marcus Hook and Trainer in South Philadelphia. He's co-sponsored with me on a bill to create a plan, a conservation plan for the Delaware River and Bay. And then I would also mention my good friend Jim Renacci, freshman Republican from Eastern Ohio, who is my co-chair in our breakfast club. These two gentlemen are people that I love working with. We don't always agree, for sure, but we work together in the case of Mr. Meehan on issues that are very important to our state, and in the case of Mr. Renacci on issues that are important to the country.
I think where the question is prompted is the fact that most people see Congress as gridlocked. However, America is also more polarized than ever before. So are we looking at a Congress that's merely just a reflection of what's going on in our country? So then can you fix it?
Well, what you look at, Nancy, is the history of how we've gotten here. Our Senate's elected for 6 years to provide stability, or Congress or House of Representatives 2 years to provide quick fixes. But what these quick fixes do is very harmful to our country. In 2008, we had a referendum election, get rid of the awful, evil, Bush administration and all its lingering effects. So what we did is we wiped out moderate Republicans in Congress. And then in 2010...
And moderate Democrats.
Moderate Republicans in 2008 during this referendum election, and then in 2010, we had the opposite effect. We had, this awful, evil administration is in here, so we have to wipe out the other side, and we wiped out moderate Democrats. What we need to do is make sure that, as the Congressman and I both have said, we need to represent our state. And we have differing views on that, but we need to work together across the aisle.
I want to give you 10 seconds just to talk about how you...
That's exactly right. People say that politicians don't listen. I think just the contrary. Politicians do listen. They listen to their constituents, and they reflect the constituents that they represent.
All right, our next student question concerns affordable health care, and it comes from a political science major at Delaware State University.
Candidates for Congress. Under the current Affordable Care Act, college students are allowed to remain under their parents' health care until the age of 26. However, this does absolutely nothing for those whose parents do not have access to health care or simply cannot afford it. What can you, as Congress, do for that college student to have access to affordable health insurance?
Mr. Carney, you're up first.
Well, in the state of Delaware, there are programs that college students can access that would allow them to get the kind of health care services that they need. We have a wonderful system of federally qualified health centers. And I've worked with Lolita Lopez and her compatriots over the years. They do tremendous work. They provide health care services on a sliding scale, and I'm sure they'd be happy to take students at any time. They're really a great resource. They're federally funded, as I said, with local funding as well. And by the way, the Affordable Care Act will require people to buy health insurance in a couple years, and so that situation for some will be cured. There's a concern I have with that with respect to whether people can afford that, but we're going to work on that as we get close to it.
Mr. Kovach.
Again, I don't think the Affordable Care Act really is addressing the problem that we need to address, which is access to health care. We talk about insurance. For me, when I was in college and then returned, I worked for a couple years and went back to law school. I had insurance, I left my job and went back to school. I went on a program called Major Medical. I was married, and my wife was expecting when we were in law school. We went to the health clinic at the school. We went to those facilities that we could work with. We didn't have access to, again, free health care under the guise of insurance. What we had is access to medical care. We could go to those clinics, we could get referrals out, and we were covered, and we could see a doctor. This false premise that we have to insure everybody, and somehow that's the only way we can have access to health care, doesn't work. It doesn't work it doesn't work with the doctors that I've spoken with. It doesn't work with the patients, and it's not working with these college students. Make sure we have access. College students, especially at UD, have access to a great health facility. Let's make sure that they can have access to that facility.
All right, let's move on to our next student question, which comes in from a senior communication major at the University of Delaware with a question on campaign spending.
As I follow this election, I wonder if more control and limits will ever be placed on campaign spending. What is your view of campaign spending, and if elected, what changes, if any, will you implement?
Mr. Kovach, you're first.
Campaign spending has clearly gotten out of control. We have the PACs giving the candidates. We have super PACs, which can, without the candidate's knowledge, advocate for or against another candidate. I don't think that's acceptable. I think the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United were actually one of the biggest, I think, fallacies of that decision is it's not the problem that the corporations are treated like people, it's that the Supreme Court said that people have a right to hear, not a right to free speech, but a right to hear. So therefore, they granted an unlimited right to corporations, which I don't think was intended, and I think can and needs to be reined in by legislation. Campaign spending is a necessary reform to ensure democracy continues. I've never been an advocate previously of term limits, but if we don't get this campaign spending under control, you will simply have incumbents getting reelected because their opponents can no longer compete. I've received 92% of my funding from individuals. My opponents receive 54% of his money from PACs. That's not an even footing from which to represent both sides of the argument.
Your minute.
Campaign spending is definitely out of control, and members like me have to spend an inordinate amount of time raising money just to be competitive. And why? Because of the case with Citizens United, a super PAC could come into this state or any other district, funded with anonymous contributions from super rich people, and dump millions of dollars on TV advertising to take somebody out, and it's very, very effective. And so in order to compete, and I'm a pretty competitive guy, you've got to raise the money to be competitive. But I'm co-sponsor of a bill, and you don't even have to disclose those contributors for those super PACs. I've co-sponsored a bill called the Disclose Act that would require disclosure for those super PACs, and I am working on a constitutional amendment that would allow the Congress to regulate campaign spending within a certain period of time of election. That's the kind of reform that we need if we're going to get this campaign spending and these politics under control.
Let me just bring up then another issue that's lingering among most of these student questions, and that's what public opinion is saying about Congress's approval rating. It's at an all-time low. So really, really quickly as we wrap up here, what would you do to restore the public's confidence in Congress? We'll start with you.
When I talk to people every day, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, what they say to me, people in Delaware, is they say, why can't you just get something done in Washington, D.C.? And as I've said time and time again, the way to do that is for Democrats and Republicans to work together, to put our differences aside, to focus on areas where we agree instead of areas where we disagree. We have to inspire confidence. We have to come up with a long-term deficit reduction plan and a budget that works, that preserves investments in education and science and technology. We have to do that. And if we do that, we'll inspire a little bit more confidence than 9% approval rating, which is terrible. But the only way to do that is to, as I talk to people in the state of Delaware, is to work across the aisle to get things done. Delaware's a little bit different. We are a special place. And I've learned that more, and I appreciate that more now today than ever before, how special this place is.
Mr. Kovach.
One of the things we need to do, absolutely, to gain our economic footing is restore the confidence of the American people, restore the confidence of the American business person. What we have is a Congress that still, to this day, exempts itself from its own legislation. We have an opportunity. We have the Federal Reserve, which sets our monetary policy in this country. We had an opportunity to vote to audit the Fed in the Congress. I would have expected our congressmen to vote in favor of auditing the Fed, to bring confidence to the American citizen, the business, that, you know, this third party that we've given this autonomy and authority to is going to be audited by us. I'm frustrated by the fact that Congressman Carney didn't vote with many Democratic colleagues to audit the Fed, to restore some of that confidence. And what we have to do, finally, we talked about campaign finance. We have all these donors that are receiving huge loopholes in their tax structure. We need to flatten the tax code to bring some trust that the American worker, the American employer, can fairly compete without having to get the best lawyer and the best lobbyist.
Well, believe it or not, we have concluded our question portion of tonight's program, and I want to thank both of you. Jason and I both want to thank you for fielding our questions.
Thank you.
And also those from the students from University of Delaware and Delaware State University. Now you each will have 1 minute for a closing statement. And Mr. Kovach, you are first.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you to UD. Thank you to DFM. Thank you to my family and my friends for supporting me, to allow me this great honor to run for Congress. I want to thank Congressman Carney for his civility during this campaign that I expect that we'll both display until the end of the campaign. I think you have a choice between two nice gentlemen, two nice family-friendly good, hardworking people that want to do the right thing for Delaware, want to work across the aisle. But what we need to do is implement some tough solutions. We can't be wanting to be everybody's friend. What we need to do is we need to take a tough stand, and we're going to need to make changes to these programs to preserve them. We need to make tough changes in Medicare and Social Security to reform them, to save them. We need to make tough changes to our health care. We can't, just because people like the sounds of free health care, can't give them an ACA. You know, that really drives up the cost without providing cost containment. We need to stand up, and I have the background and the experience to be able to represent Delaware in Congress. Thank you.
Mr. Carney, your closing statement.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Jason, for your questions. I want to thank the University of Delaware and Delaware First Media again for sponsoring this debate. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and a particular thanks to the students for your question. We have very serious challenges to address as a country, and Congress has a lot of work to do. But it's going to require Democrats and Republicans to work together. Down in Washington, I've worked across the aisle to get things done, and we've had some success getting 3 bills passed, but there's so much more to do. We need to pass a 10-year fiscal plan that gets our budget deficits under control. We've got to help businesses create jobs and getting the economy moving faster again. The only way to do that is to send people to Washington who are willing to work together to get things done. If you re-elect me, and I ask people for their vote on November the 6th, I will continue to do that as your congressman. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. That wraps up this U.S. House of Representatives debate for this evening. And as we begin to prepare for our next debate, WDDE's Patrick Mayers offers this look at the issues that are driving the decisions of voters in Delaware this election season. And it comes as absolutely no surprise. Jobs and economy top the list.
Delaware's quadrennial season of change is here once again. And while the slate of candidates differs with every election cycle, there's one issue that's always on the minds of voters.
The jobs, the jobs, the jobs. And that's what I think is the most important thing, getting this economy turned around.
I come from a conservative background, you know, religious and everything else, but in this economy, we can't afford to vote on simply religion or abortion, non-abortion. I think the most important decision is economic, you know, job focused.
Jobs that are available for people that, you know, where they can actually make a living and, you know, support themselves when they get displaced, when the, you know, economy changes.
People are still concerned. They're worried about their investments, their retirement. They're worried about their children's opportunities for jobs as well as their own jobs.
Longtime University of Delaware political science professor Joe Pica has been following first state politics for more than 30 years.
Delaware's changed.
Even though Delaware's unemployment rate is lower than the national average, he says the local economy is going through a transition that's remaking the state and driving the issues.
I think what's happened is that we're probably more of a white-collar economy than we used to be, with both of the auto industry, both of the auto plants shutting down. Manufacturing and blue-collar workers don't have the same sort of position, I think, in the economy that they did have in the past.
With a well-populated north and rural south, Delaware has long held a reputation as a microcosm of the nation. So it's not a surprise, then, that other concerns of Delawareans also echo those heard across the country.
I think education remains a really hot topic, a major concern.
The most important issue would be health care. Would actually be health care, how they plan to spruce the welfare, and how they actually help us to get us out of our certain economy structure. So in the next 10 to 15 years, whatever they don't correct now, it's going to cripple us later.
I think the main concern right now is just health care, just a different point of views and opinions in regards to the Democratic and Republican ideas as far as the future health and endeavors as far as the youth and the older Medicare.
I think the government is infringing too much on the churches. There's just a lot of things that just aren't what I think they should be.
Whatever your opinion, there's no disputing the importance of expressing it at the polls.
Without voting, you don't have an opinion. I mean, if your opinion isn't heard, it's you're basically not living, in my opinion, because the fact is to be living in a place and you don't even want to have your opinion heard, why are you here?
I think it's very important to vote because the next 4 years, We're either going to have same as, or we're going to have a change and try to get things turned around and moving.
We are Americans, and as Americans, we have freedom of speech and we have a right to vote. We have a right to at least breach our decision, even though our vote might not make the president because it's actually based off the electoral votes. We actually feel like we can make a difference.
Most people say voting doesn't matter, but it does. In the overall, you just never know how it's going to turn out.
It's the only way that I can do anything to change anything. If I don't vote, I don't have anyone to blame but myself.
It's our responsibility as a citizen.
Voters are ready to listen. Candidates are making their final pitches, and the clock is ticking down to November 6th. Patrick Mayers, WDDE News.